IR Today, brought to you by the National Investor Relations Institute, dedicated to advancing global investor relations practices, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member.
Hi, I'm Jeff Morgan, President and CEO of the National Investor Relations Institute, NIRI. I'd like to welcome you to IR Today. This is a new webcast series that we're bringing to you on issues related to IR, investor relations, and financial communications. We're delighted to be here, and we wouldn't be here without our Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member. Today we're going to welcome TK Kerstetter, President of Corporate Board Member, and we appreciate all your support and assistance to make this program happen.
Jeff, it is our pleasure. It's interesting being on this side of it after all the shows that we've done for the board members. So the fact that we know communication is more important in the boardroom all the time. So the fact that we can be a host of a show that will bridge investor relations and the boardroom, we're happy to do it.
Well, we appreciate the help. Today we're going to talk about the future of investor relations. And for those of you that don't know about NIRI, NIRI is a 40-year-old organization. And our focus has been the same for really the past 40 years, and that is financial communications. And we do that by focusing on professional development, advocacy, information, and community for in the IR world. And today we also have with us to talk about the future of IR, Derek Cole, who is NIRI's chair, and he is with Arco Biopharma. And there he is Vice President of Investor Relations and Head of Corporate Communications. Derek, welcome.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here for the first session.
Well, appreciate you being here. And Derek, I think I want to start with you. And I mean, you've had a long career in investor relations and seen a lot of change. And really, when we talk about how the world is evolving, why don't you talk a little bit about how you've seen change and what change you've seen in the world of IR?
Sure. I think over the history of investor relations, there has been a dramatic amount of change. I think the two important features for me are an interrelated evolution, one in moving from tactical to strategic in the execution of what IR does. And tied directly with that, I think, is a transformation from a function or a position as an investor relations officer to a profession. And what originally started out as more of a one-way communication external function has now evolved into a strategic interaction with the investment community, management teams, and board members. And I think corresponding to that, the other big changes we've seen have been in the capital markets and in the institutional investment community and the sell side. There's been a huge transformation. And I think the best outcome of that has been a much more rich, robust conversation among corporate issuers, the board members, and the institutional investment community.
Thanks. Makes perfect sense. TK, from your standpoint in the boardroom, clearly what Derek is saying and how that has changed, things have changed in the boardroom too. How do you see it?
Yeah, it's really building on what Derek said, from the boardroom's perspective, we saw the first dramatic change with Sarbanes-Oxley, and I think that really was a huge spark in changing sort of the attitude and just the whole foundational philosophy of the boardroom. And then the big thing is transparency. I mean, when you look at what had been a closed door kind of thing and look at the transparency that's happened since then, and you might even argue, I would make a case that there's too much transparency, but we'll save that for another show. And the last thing I think, which was mentioned, but we mention it every day on This Week in the Boardroom, and that's communication with the shareholders. That has evolved in so many forms. Again, not always good. When we talk about the fifth analyst call and we talk about putting directors in front of shareholders, that is not without risk. So I think all those are big changes for the boardroom, and some of the boards are still getting used to that.
Yeah. Well, playing off that, NIRI has spent about a year going into a deep dive of where the whole realm of IR and investor communications is going. And we really see the world changing at a much quicker pace than it has in years past, particularly because of regulation evolving very quickly, how you communicate and all the mediums for communication. Financial markets are changing. The world is just changing, globalization. And I'm curious to get both of your thoughts, because from an IR standpoint, we want to make sure, and part of the job of NIRI is to make sure that the profession stays up on all this and stays ahead of all this so that we really can serve our constituencies and have good investor relations and good financial communication. So what are your thoughts on how those aspects are changing?
Probably one of the biggest things to me that it's going to change the boardroom is going to be all that's evolved out of the majority voting and the proxy 452, which restricts the brokers voting. And why this is so important is it's given light to be able to withhold votes on individual directors, on committees, and on whole boards. And say what you will, this has had an impact on directors. And one of the things that I worry about is that it has, again, too much influence where you're starting to see people make decisions rather than what's right is what's right to be safe. And that's going to put tremendous pressure on IR, for the types of information and what do we do and what do we communicate. So that's something. The normal proxy access, we saw that get defeated, this summer. Now it's back in private ordering and company by company. I think that's companies better be prepared for that. That's work for IR. Social media, I'm not going to take the time, but we all know how that is evolving so quickly. You talk about transparency. You could have a short flight and the world could have changed by the time you get off on that. And the last thing is disclosures. And I think there's been some good disclosures and there's been some bad disclosures. When I look at the diversity, statement in the proxy, and I look at the qualifications and experience, those have really been what I call lawyered up. And I'm not sure that they're serving the purpose that they were meant for. So now you have this work and all this stuff that affects, again, investor relations that I'm not sure is meeting the purpose of what it was originally created for.
Yeah, and that's certainly the tightrope that we walk between providing information and dealing with the fact that we are in a legal environment. Derek, thoughts?
Well, Jeff, I think you covered a lot of the main areas with regulation and communications change that are really accelerating what investor relations officers are responsible for. And I think while there's a lot to absorb, it's a great opportunity for the profession because we can provide a true benefit to our companies and board members and the management teams. And when you look at the areas that we need to understand, and particularly how the markets have changed and the impacts of volatility, my company, for example, we had an interesting, I guess I could use the word interesting experience, where as a small cap company, we have about 8.6 million shares outstanding, a VC held company, so about half of that is locked up, and based upon some trading one day, we traded 55 million shares. We were number 4 behind Microsoft. So I think that makes it incumbent upon us as IROs to understand that and have the knowledge that we can provide the comfort to management teams and board members that we understand what's going on and can either address it ourselves or raise it to the level it needs, because I think the pace and constant change that you both have mentioned really drive, I think, what's an important issue for everyone, and that's that a lot of those items are urgent but not important. Or they're significant, but we as IROs need to help all of our constituencies, including the investment community, focus on what's important for the long-term growth of the company, not what may be a fire today, but isn't really a long-term issue.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. One of the things I don't think either of you mentioned or not in depth is globalization. And as we look at the world, we've seen half the investment capital in the world is in the U.S., half the investment capital is outside the U.S. We've seen public companies, used to be the U.S. was the majority of the area where public companies were formed. And that really has turned into more of a global environment. A lot of public companies are coming into existence, not in the U.S., but in other markets. And then, as we operate our businesses, we are very much a global business, and we have global competitors. How do you see that change, either one of you or both of you? What are your thoughts there on the whole world becoming much smaller and we're all intertwined?
Well, I think you hit the point correctly, and that's that if you are a public company, in most cases private company as well, but definitely if you are a public company, you are a global company because your shareholder base is likely to be global. And I think in a lot of cases, when you think of some large multinational corporations, you assume that, but even small companies, their shareholder bases now can largely be global in nature, and that global aspect can be sometimes the first exposure a company has to being global. So we all need to be cognizant of that, and particularly in the IR profession, we need to help guide that, because managing a global shareholder base really gives you both a lot of opportunities and a lot of responsibilities in dealing with a different environment than a small state or just national shareholder base.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I will just echo Derek's comments and add, to me, that is such an excellent opportunity to do a show in the future on bringing some IROs that have dealt with that, who companies are clearly global today, are having to deal with that by having ownership across the world. That seems like a perfect show for IR today, to get some of those people in here and hear what they have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And as part of our strategic planning, we look at globalization as being something that's very important, and where we look at it is more from a standards point of view. When you look at how investor relations practice across the globe, clearly there is a regulatory aspect that every country has their sovereign laws or has an SEC type environment. But there's a lot of what we do from investor relations that should be a common practice and the same across the globe. And NIRI has one of our core things that we've done really since 1969 is develop standards of practice for how investor relations operates, what is the norm in the U.S. And we feel that NIRI is in a great position to lead and bring that out to the globe and start to work towards a standard way for IR to operate around the globe. So that's one of the things that is very core at our strategic plan for the coming years. And it's very exciting too. Well, gentlemen, our time is drawing to a close, and time goes very quickly. And we appreciate all of you joining us, and we appreciate you joining us. And this is a program that, as we said, today is the launch, and it's a program that we will come to you several times throughout the year with IR Today shows. And we appreciate, again, Corporate Board Member being a Knowledge Partner host, and appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next IR Today.
Join us again next time for IR Today, brought to you by the National Investor Relations Institute, dedicated to advancing global investor relations practices, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member.